Dr. Sommer is a political science professor at Tel Aviv University. He's held leadership positions at the Israel Young Academy and the Israeli Cyber Forum at Columbia University. He has extensive research interests, including comparative and American politics, politics of sexuality and gender, judicial politics, pandemics and politics, and cybersecurity. He has published over 40 peer-reviewed articles in top outlets and has received several grants and fellowships. Udi co-led a team that won a grant of 1 million new Israeli shekels from the U.S. State Department and the Fulbright program to establish a new center for the study of the United States in Tel Aviv. Before his academic career, Dr. Sommer founded and directed social programs for underprivileged youth and completed advanced graduate training in clinical psychology. Dr. Sommer is our John Jay Research Visiting Scholar for Fall 2023. Welcome, Dr. Sommer.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I want to say thank you to the various people. Some of them are in the room, and some of them are not. Then we're going to watch a short clip with Bono and U2, which I'm assuming everybody here loves, and then I'll start my talk. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank my my hosts and sponsors. So Amy, my dear colleague and friend, Amy Adamczyk from the sociology department here, and Andrew Seidman from political science, who's now also a dean. These two people are, it's their fault that I'm here, and I'm really grateful. It's been a tremendous experience so far. I'd like to thank the John Jay community. Okay, I'm feeling, I've been here since early August. I'm feeling just absolutely welcome, and it's been exciting intellectually and emotionally and on a personal level. I want to thank the political science department and the sociology department for co-sponsoring my fellowship here. I'd like to thank Maxwell Mack, who's my grad school buddy, but also the chair of political science. And hi, Andrew. I just thanked you and you missed it, but here is Andrew. And Professor Robert Garrott, the chair of sociology. I'd like to thank the president of John Jay and the provost. I was supposed to meet them tomorrow, but something didn't quite work, so I'll meet them hopefully sometime soon. I'd like to thank everybody from the Office for the Advancement of Research, so Anthony and Dan and all your staff. You've been really super supportive before I arrived here and since I arrived here, and even in times like this. Thanks for your words. And I'd like to thank my friends and family and colleagues in New York and in the USA in general for your support throughout the summer, and especially on those days. Some of the people are here, so thank you all. So Remy, I think, oh, here's the clip. Okay, so this clip is Bono from 2 days ago, and I'll let him speak for himself.
In the light of what's happened in Israel and Gaza, a song about non-violence seems somewhat ridiculous, even laughable, but our prayers have always been for peace and for non-violence. So, but our hearts and our anger, you know what that's pointed to. So sing with us. And those beautiful kids at that music festival. Early morning, October 7th, as the sun is rising in the desert sky, stars of David, they took your life, but they could not take your pride. Could not take your pride. Could not take your pride. Could not take
Okay, so you can hit the next slide, please. So I'm going to ask Remy. Remy, I should have thanked Remy as well for everything she's done. So Remy is going to switch the slides for me today. Okay, so the talk was planned before, when the world was before October 7th, okay? But I think that it's pertinent in many ways to October 7th, and I'll signal out two ways in which I think the talk is relevant to today and to American audiences, an American audience particularly, but I'll mostly focus on the talk, and I'll make the links, and of course during Q&A we can go back to those links or whatever you are interested in. So the first level at which it's related, okay, I'm going to talk a lot about democracy and the importance of democracy in the world and the division between democratic nations and the democratic world and everything else. You know, there's many nations, many people who live in non-democratic countries. And I think that with the clouds of war that are gathering over the Middle East right now and the American involvement there, this is going to be pertinent. So what we had in the Cold War is going to be important today because we're seeing those fault lines emerging again between America and its democratic allies and the rest of the world. And there's, that's unfortunate, but that's the reality. And I'll talk a lot about democracy, and I will, link, I think, the links between Israeli democracy and this bigger question of world order and international relations and peace and war. The links are there, and I'll get to them. But they're not the heart. The heart is really talking about democracy and talking about Israeli democracy. So this is the first level, I think, where this is pertinent. The structure of the talk is the following. So I know they told me that there might be some students here, so I'm going to talk very briefly about the size of the country, okay, about the neighborhood. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline, okay. I'll go over those things relatively quickly because my sense is that most of the people here are senior, probably more senior than me even. Then we'll talk about the Israeli political system and try to, focus it, compare it to the American system. And then we'll get to the heart of the story, which is the proposed judicial reform of 2023, okay, and the justification and basically the theory that I would like to propose, okay, that has a lot to do with the tension between the popular will and the rule of law, which is the second level at which I think an American audience can really relate, even if you don't, if you're not too interested in Israeli politics. Because I think the rule of law, the tension between the rule of law and the popular will is crucial to American politics, has been, since the foundation of the Republic and certainly today. And then I'll try to offer my alternative hypothesis, okay? The null hypothesis in a nutshell is that the proposed reform in Israel would curb the courts because the courts usurped the power of the people, okay? I think it sounds familiar, right? You heard that in America as well, okay? My alternative hypothesis is that the truth is the complete opposite, okay? What the court, particularly the Supreme Court, has done since the 1990s when it became more dominant is actually serve the will of the people, okay? What the people in Israel want and how the people in Israel identify themselves is first and foremost as a democracy. Also as a Jewish state, for sure, but first and foremost as a democracy in their understanding of themselves, in the way they identify their country in the world. And what the court has done is basically serve the popular will, okay? And I'll make this argument in great detail. And then I'll talk about implications. So, Remy, we can... Okay, so in terms of the size, Israel is the little red dot in the center, okay? Remy, one more. Please. This is New Jersey and Israel, okay? How many people here are from Jersey? Okay, thanks. So, about the same size. How many people are from Chicago? Great. So look at, Lake Michigan is bigger than Israel, okay? That's how small it is. Okay, next, Remy, please. In terms of the neighborhood, colors are not amazing, okay? But what you see here is Israel is right here, okay? That's the size of Israel, and you can see Iran. What you have, those semicircles are the missile ranges from Iran. Okay, so you see that Israel is well covered, and not just Israel, but even countries in Eastern Europe are covered by the missile ranges from Iran. And Remy, one more, please. Again, the colors are not ideal, but what you see here, what we see unfolding in Israel now, okay, is really tension not between Israel and the Palestinians only, okay? Iran supports in major ways, many of them we're still to find out about, okay? You know, it's still something that is being either secretive because there's military operations there, or it's secretive because it's a threat to national security. But the reality is that the tensions that you see are between Iran and its allies, which is Iraq, which Iran effectively controls, Syria, whose murderous president Bashar al-Assad with various war crimes is a very strong ally of Iran, Lebanon and Hezbollah, and Russia as well. And if you see the Israeli case, you can see that both the Gaza Strip, Hamas, and parts of Lebanon that are controlled by Hezbollah. So essentially what you see here is a conflict between, it would be wrong to think about it as a conflict between just Israel and Hamas. It is a conflict between Israel and Iran and allies of Iran or proxies of Iran. Remy? What you see here is the missile ranges from Gaza, okay? This is taken from the New York Times, in case you think, you know, what I'm saying is biased politically. This is taken from the New York Times website, and what you see here is how the missile ranges increased over time. So you see the Gaza Strip as if you're in an airplane over the Nile Delta, probably in Egypt, okay? So you're sitting in an airplane above the Nile Delta, and you look into Israel over the Gaza Strip, okay? So this is the Gaza Strip over here, and this is Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, okay? And you can see how in 2002 the range was, you know, that much. 2008 it almost hit Tel Aviv. By 2012 it hit Tel Aviv, and by 2014 missile ranges from Gaza are effectively covering the country, okay? And what you saw in the last 3 days is that now it's not just missiles, but obviously it's also ground attacks. Remy, thanks. In terms of the timeline, again, I'm pretty sure that everybody here knows that, but just to go quickly, and it's really blurred, so you probably can't really read it, but 1917, okay, is when, anybody has a pointer maybe? No. 1917, the Balfour Declaration, okay, the Jewish right to the land is declared. State of Israel is founded in 1948. Six-Day War in 1967. Israel, in a surprise attack, takes over large territories in all of its neighboring countries, other than Lebanon maybe, and in 6 days has a major victory. In 1973, on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, Israel is attacked and is able to eventually win the war. This was 50 years ago and 1 day from last Saturday. Okay. First Intifada, 1987, the Palestinian uprising. The Oslo Peace Accords, 1993. We'll talk a lot about the 1990s today. Okay, 1990s are critical for the argument that I'd like to make. Second Intifada, the second uprising in the early 2000s. I think this is less important, and October of 2023 is when I just don't think this it is over, so I don't want to say what it is exactly, but we are in the midst of an unfolding event. So this is the timeline, real brief. Thanks, Remy. Next one, please. Again, I'll go that quickly, okay, because I just want to take advantage that there's so many professors here to get to the heart of my argument, but just to quickly compare Israel and the United States, okay? So there are various differences. Israel is a parliamentary system. The United States is a presidential system. The presidential system, as you know, elections are held separately to the executive and the legislature. Separation of powers is very clear, okay? You guys know when election year starts because you have predictability. Elections are, in the United States, you vote for your member of Congress and you vote separately for your presidential candidate, okay? In a parliamentary system, the separation of powers is non-existent, essentially, not just in Israel, okay? But in general, in a parliamentary system, the executive and the legislature are in many ways so connected that you have the same people there, okay? The executive is completely dependent on the legislature. If they don't have the majority, either in the form of a coalition, or the form of a one big party, then they can't run the country, they can't govern. So there's really the kind of checks and balances that you're familiar with in the United States are not really present in the Israeli system. Okay, so let's think about checks and balances in this country. Okay, you have, as I mentioned, the executive is completely separate from the legislature. Okay. Elections are held on the same day, but separately, essentially. You have various levels of government, right? You have the federal government, the state government, the local government, and they also check each other. You have two chambers of the legislature, so there's some checks and balances there. You have, and you have the Supreme Court, which is completely independent and separate, okay? Maybe I missed a couple, but it's a nice list of checks and balances, right? Now, compare this list to the Israeli case. In the Israeli case, there's only one, okay? And that's the Supreme Court. Essentially, in a parliamentary system such as the Israeli system, there's no other checks and balances. There's one chamber of the legislature, so that you don't have this internal check, okay? You don't really have local and you don't have state government because it's not a federal system, and the local government is very, very weak, okay? Elections, you hold elections, you vote just for the party, and that determines the legislature and the executive. There's no real separation between the executive and the legislature, so the Supreme Court is the only check in a parliamentary system. Okay? Okay. Remy, please. Okay. Here you can just enjoy the colors, okay? But the key idea here, okay, what you have here is the history of the country from 1948 all the way to, whatever, 2020 or so, okay? And, you obviously can't read anything because it's a blur and it's too small, but you can enjoy the colors and see what they mean. And what they mean is, okay, the light blue colors are right-wing parties, okay? The parties here in the center are centrist parties, and the dark blue parties are the left-wing parties, okay? And what you can see very clearly is that for many, many years, decades actually, 3 decades, left-wing completely dominated the Israeli political scene. Then there were about a couple of decades where it was more or less even, and now there's virtually no left-wing to talk about. Okay? There's really no left-wing government. Now that's very important because one of the null hypotheses that I'd like to refute here is the idea and the common understanding of Israeli politics as organized by left-wing versus right-wing. What I'd like to argue is that that is wrong. Okay? Israeli politics is not organized as left-wing versus right-wing, but by a different mechanism. Okay? And I think just by this, and by the way, this is not the last election. So in the last election, this dark blue left-wing on the left is gone. Okay? Just one party passed the electoral threshold. We have an electoral threshold because it's a multi-party system. Okay? So there's really no left wing. So if you want to explain something, and there's two elements, left wing and right wing, and one element is gone, then probably your explanatory mechanism is gone as well. Okay? Remy? Okay, so we said there's only one check on the Israeli government. Okay? Unlike the American case where we said there were like 7 or 10, or depending on how you count them. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court enjoys judicial independence. Okay, it enjoys judicial independence by tradition, by path dependence, and also by law. Okay, there's basic law, the Supreme Court from 1984, that entrenches the independence of the court. Remy? Okay, judicial appointments. That's a very contentious issue in the reform. I'll get there in a second. Okay, but the appointment process in Israel is such that you don't have the American spectacle of, judicial appointments and in Congress, and the entire country is glued to the screens with for the duration of the hearings. Okay, it's in a committee. It's a secretive committee, but the idea of the committee is that it's supposed to be balanced. Okay, you have members of the executive, members of the legislature, members of the profession, and members of the judiciary. Okay, I won't get into all the details, but that's the idea. Okay, it's supposed to be balanced and secretive. Okay, so the appointments are supposed to be professional. Okay, this kind of committee is supposed to select the best jurists in the land. Okay, Remy, next one, please. In terms of judicial review has started before the night. So we had our Marbury moment. Okay, for you it happened in 1803. Okay, some of you may remember that. For us, it happened in 1995. Okay, we had the Mizrahi moment. Okay, the Mizrahi Bank is a decision essentially where the Supreme Court creates judicial review. It's true that judicial review had existed before the 1990s. Okay, but it was more on procedural grounds. And in the judicial arena, it's very different if you do something on procedural grounds as opposed to substantive grounds. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court says there are substantive reasons for us to be able to say that certain acts of elected officials are unconstitutional. Okay? Remy? In terms of justiciability, this is a very complicated word. Basically means something very simple. What are the topics that the Supreme Court can decide on? Okay? Are they allowed to decide on certain topics? It has something else, it's not like standing or things like that. It's what is justiciable, okay? What can be processed and decided on the court, okay? And in the 1990s, another thing that the court says is that basically everything is justiciable, okay? Just for comparison, in America, there's also a justiciability doctrine, okay? Formally, there are certain topics that are not justiciable, but, the reality is that everything is justiciable in America as well, okay? So it's a doctrine that has been largely, left, so I don't think I ever heard a Supreme Court justice in America or Chief Justice saying everything is justiciable like they said in Israel. So Israelis have the chutzpah, it's well known, okay? But in reality, even in this country, everything is justiciable, right? I mean, in 2000, it was your Supreme Court that decided who's going to win the elections. What's more political than who's going to be the president of the United States? Okay, Remy? Okay, so the Judicial Revolution of the 1990s, okay? Hopefully you leave this room today with some question marks about whether it was really a revolution. Because the revolution, suggests that somebody did something against the will of someone else, right? And it was a revolutionary process, and I'd like to argue otherwise, okay? But the revolution, let's just talk about the null hypothesis for a second, or like the standard story. The standard story it has the elements that I mentioned, okay? So the court articulates the power of judicial review. So we have the Marbury moment, okay? The Mizrahi moment. The court says that everything is justiciable. So the Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak, who's considered by many a great villain and by others a great, a great person or almost a holy person. Okay, this is what he said. I'm quoting his words. Everything is justiciable. Okay, and the court essentially, and Israel has no constitution. Okay, maybe it is something that I should have mentioned earlier. It has no constitution. So what the court said was that the basic laws, okay, which are supposed to be some sort of a piecemeal process in which a constitutional structure is formed, the basic laws have superior standard or superior standing or superior status over regular laws, and therefore judicial review would be in light of those basic laws and also the Proclamation of Independence and some other foundational documents. Okay, Remy. Okay, so, and here we get to 2023. Okay, I haven't said anything new, by the way, so far. Okay, everything that I said so far is in the literature, it's in the textbooks. Okay, and in 2023, 2022 in November, you have your midterm elections, and we have our general elections. And Netanyahu is re-elected for the 5th time prime minister. Okay, he forms a coalition with extreme right-wing parties and with some ultra-Orthodox parties, and he appoints Yariv Levin a member of his Likud party, as Minister of Justice. And Minister Levin's quest, almost throughout his political career, has been to curb the Supreme Court. Okay, so you can see a quote of his from 2011, so 11 years before he becomes a Minister of Justice. He says, it's no secret that a minority group with extreme left-wing politics dominates the legal system, particularly the Supreme Court. Okay? That's my translation from, not my research assistant translation from Hebrew to English, but I think it's more or less accurate. Okay? And then when he, people have dreams, and in some cases they can realize them. So if you dream to be the Minister of Justice for many years, and then you become the Minister of Justice, you realize your dreams. Okay? This is exactly what Levin was trying to do. What did he do? He created a reform, and the reform has 4 major pillars. The first one is reducing the scope and frequency of judicial review. So for judicial review, Israeli court decides, unlike here all, you have 9 justices, and all 9 justices participate on all cases, right? It's called en banc, right? All of them make all decisions, okay? The Israeli court is similar in many ways to the lower level federal courts here, where you make decisions in panels, okay? So most decisions are decided in panels of 3 or 5 or 7 justices, an uneven number, an odd number, and out of the 15 justices that serve on the court, okay? So far for judicial review, you just needed the majority of the justices on your panel. What Levin was trying to do was to make sure that, first of all, if you want to overrule the decision of an elected branch, what you needed to do is to have all of the justices on the panel, and you needed either unanimity or supermajority on the panel for this to happen. Okay? Essentially meaning that very, very hard to exercise judicial review. Okay? Another, Remy, next one, please. Okay, just one more point about that. Okay? In this country as well, right? You have all sorts like veto bargaining, right, between the president and the legislature. I mean, there are all sorts of checks and balances. Okay? So one thing that the legislature could do is to decide, in this country as well, that with a certain level of supermajority, they can overrule the decision of the court if the court exercises judicial review. Okay? So, and that makes sense, right? Because sometimes the court may be wrong, but you want a lot of, a large majority of your legislature to agree that the court is wrong, because these are the legal experts. They're in charge of interpreting the Constitution. In Israel, you have 120 members of the legislature in this one branch, okay? This one chamber. One chamber with 120 people, okay? What is the majority out of 120, Zach? 61. Excellent. This is what you need, 61 members according to this reform, which basically means that any coalition can overrule any decision of the court, okay, by construction, okay? A coalition needs at least 61 members, so any decision of the court is rendered meaningless. Next, limiting the... Remy, you going no, Remy? Yeah, thanks. Limiting the power of legal counsel. Okay, so legal counsel is a very important element in the government. I won't get into the details here. Granting the coalition control over the Judicial Selection Committee. This is probably the most important item of the reform. Okay, anybody knowing anything about judicial politics, and even if you don't know anything about judicial politics, you just follow American news coverage, you know that it's really important who are the people on the court, right? Otherwise, Congress and the president wouldn't bother to fight over this and put so many political resources into it. Okay. What they tried to do, okay, is actually they used you guys, they used the American system and said, look, in America, it's the politicians who make the decision. They make the appointments, okay? Well, in America, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the politicians may be making the appointments, but then you have 7 other layers of checks and balances, okay, to make sure that there is no abuse of power. As I mentioned, in Israel, there's one. And if all the members on this one institution are appointed by the coalition, I think you can imagine that there's not going to be too much checking and balancing there. Okay? And the last aspect is reasonableness. Okay, that's one of the doctrines that the court, one of the major doctrines that the court used. And again, I won't get into all the details here, but again, it's seriously curbing the power of the court. Okay. What is the justification? Well, the justification, I think, is going to sound very familiar to an American audience. The justification is that the court usurps the power of the people. And that's the reason why we should curb the power of the court. Okay? And the key argument is that it all happened in the 1990s. So I described the Marbury moment in the 1990s. Okay? I described the activism of the court. We talked about justiciability, okay, the extensive argument about justiciability. And the argument is that since the 1990s, with this ego-inflated person called Aharon Barak, okay, and I'm not using, this is not my language, I'm quoting the way the people who supported the reform talked about it, the Israeli Supreme Court took over the country and usurp the power of the elected branches and the power of the people. And therefore, it should be curbed. Okay, I think this is very simple. Again, it's I think very familiar to the ears of people who follow American politics. And if this is the case, then the reform is justified, right? I mean, in a democracy, the majority rule is really, really important. Okay. Remy, we can move on to the next one. And this is the story of popular will versus the rule of law. And I use this visual here just to make it very clear, okay? What happens if Donald Trump is elected president and is also found guilty in one or many or several of his various legal procedures that are going on against him right now? Okay, what do you do? Okay, this is just one example. Obviously, there's many other examples. I'm not advocating to put Trump behind bars. I'm not trying to take any stance here. I'm just trying to clarify, okay, that this is a real thing, okay? The tension between popular will and the rule of law is a real thing in any democracy, okay? In the American system and in the Israeli system, okay? Okay. My alternative theory. Okay, so again, everything that I said so far is still nothing new. Now starts the new stuff. Hopefully you find it interesting, okay? So remember, first thing is we said the organizing mechanism or the organizing principle of Israeli politics was left-wing versus right-wing. And I said that this was wrong. And at least one reason why it's wrong is that there's no left-wing, right? So how do you explain something with two elements when one element is just not there, okay? But beyond that, I think that it's very clear since the constitutive moment of Israel, the proclamation of independence, that there is something else that really explains the system, and that's the tension between democracy, the democratic elements of the nation, and the Jewish elements of the nation. Israel, in the proclamation of independence, is defined as a Jewish democracy. Okay? And it is this tension. So it's different than left versus right, because left versus right is dichotomous, right? It's either a left-wing government or a right-wing government, other than some exceptions, but for the most part, okay? Judaism and democracy is really about the point of balance. If the country is defined as a Jewish democracy, then you're going to have those two elements in the country forever, okay? This is what it says in the Proclamation of Independence. But the question is, how close, or what would be the point of balance between this Jewish element and the democratic element? Let me give you one example. I was planning to give you more than one, but I think I'm running out of time, okay? Think about the one from the 1990s, okay? Think about the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords are the Israeli and the Palestinians signed a peace treaty in the 1990s under the leadership of Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, okay? First of all, let's refute the left versus right thing, okay? And then I'll show you how the democracy versus Jewish elements work better. Rabin actually follows when he leads Israel into the Oslo Accords, he follows in the footsteps of two prime ministers before him. One of them is Begin, okay? Begin in the 1970s signs an agreement, a peace agreement with the Egyptians, and part of that agreement is the understanding that there's going to be a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and that the principle is going to be land for peace. The Palestinians are going to get land, and Israel is going to get peace in return. This is Begin, okay? If you know anything about Israeli politics, he's extremely right-wing. Next is Yitzhak Shamir. I think the two of them compete which one would be considered more right-wing, okay? Yitzhak Shamir leads Israel in the late 1980s into the late 1980s and early 1990s into the Madrid process, okay? Again, Israel is in a peace process with the Palestinians, and again, the principle is going to be land for peace, okay? So when Rabin in Oslo actually exercised the land for peace principle, he just follows in the footsteps of those extreme right-wing leaders. So it's really hard to argue that Rabin is doing anything left-wing when he leads the Oslo Accords. Okay. Beyond that, okay. So this is to refute the left versus right. The justification that Rabin gives for the Oslo Accord, he says, listen, if we don't have this agreement, this peace agreement with the Palestinians, okay, what is going to happen is that we're going to have a majority of Palestinians, or too many Palestinians, to actually call ourselves a democracy, okay? It won't be majority rule, and we won't be able to exercise the principles of democracy if the occupation continues, okay? This is his justification. And think about the people who assassinated him. Not the person who assassinated him, but the justification. What was the justification? The justification for the person who assassinated Rabin and for the ideology behind him, okay, was that Israeli democracy doesn't matter, okay? It's about the Holy Land for the Jews. And if we need to assassinate a democratically elected prime minister for that, we'll do that. Okay? So again, it's the Jewish versus democratic. It's not really about left-wing versus right-wing. I'm not saying that there's no left-wing versus right-wing parties in Israel. There are. But if you really want to understand Israeli politics, and right from the very beginning, it's democratic versus Jewish. Second element is vagueness. People don't like vagueness. I dislike vagueness as well. Okay? But vagueness is sometimes good. And anybody who studied constitutions knows that. Okay? Vagueness is a good thing sometimes. And the reality is that the vagueness in Israel, which is a result of the fact that there is no constitution, has really helped Israeli leaders over the years. And in many ways, if you try to understand how in this extremely complex system, the Zionist project still survived, it's not despite of this vagueness, but it's actually due to this vagueness. The fact that things are not as clear as they are in the American case, or in other cases where you have a clear constitution. And the third element, okay, is based on those two elements, is a completely new understanding of the 1990s. Okay? So what happens in the 1990s? Let's think about it for a second. And this is something that, for me, it's mind-boggling. I don't do too much research about Israeli politics, but when I did review the literature, the thing that was mind-boggling to me is the fact that when people write about the 1990s in Israel, they completely ignore the most important thing that happened in the late 80s and early 90s, which is the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was a watershed event. I think it's in the lifetime of almost everybody that is in the room. Okay? It was a watershed event in the history of probably the most important event in the second half of the 20th century. Okay? And what happened in the 1990s? Okay? What happened in the end of the Cold War? Sorry. What happened in the end of the Cold War was that what was the Cold War about? If I try to really simplify things, okay, it was democracy or the democratic idea against communist authoritarianism, or however you want to, the alternative. Let's just call it the alternative for now, okay? Because it wasn't really communism, and we can get into those details, but they're not important for us for now, okay? It was democracy versus the alternative, okay? Now, remember what we talked about the Israeli system, but the local system, it was democracy versus Judaism. So we have democracy versus the alternative at the global level throughout the entire period since the Second World War, throughout the Cold War. And we have democracy versus Judaism in Israel. And then the Cold War ends. And he doesn't end in a wishy-washy kind of way, right? The Cold War ends with very clear victors. You know who won the war, okay? You know that America and Western Europe and the European Union, okay, they are the winners. How do you know that everybody knows that? Because everybody gravitates towards democracy, right? You see that in the entire world, okay? Everybody is trying to be more democratic. For Eastern European countries, it's because they want to join the EU. For other countries, they have various reasons, okay? But you see how the entire world gravitates towards the winners. Why? Well, because it's like soccer, football, baseball. We want to be on the winning side, right? I mean, that's human, right? Everybody wants to be with the winners. Nobody wants to be with the losers, right? And it's true until today. Everybody wants to be with those winners, the winners of the Cold War, okay? Western democracies. So think about, let's go back to Israel for a second. So at the global level, you have this clear victor. Democracy, beats the alternative. That has a profound influence on what's happening in Israel, okay? Because this tension between democratic and Jewish, all of a sudden gets, the balance is completely different now, because it's not two elements that are, kind of important, but obviously everybody wants to show that they are democratic to themselves. The country wants to show it to themselves. We want to show it to the world, okay? This is a very strong currency in the 1990s, being a democracy. Okay, if you want to be on the right clubs in the international system, if you want to get the benefits from America, from the European Union, you want to have the right friends in the right places, you want to be a democracy. Okay? So Israel gravitates or tilts toward democracy in a very powerful way, and that's something that is not top-down. Okay? This is completely bottom-up. Okay? The people, and I'll show you in a second what happens with the elected branches, just a few examples. Okay? So the people have a huge appetite to become more democratic. But then the question is, how do you become more democratic? Well, you have your government help you be more democratic. And your government consists of, the executive, the legislature, and the court. I'll talk about the legislature and the executive in a second. But the heart of my argument, the core of my argument, is what the court does in the 1990s is serve this appetite for democracy, this popular appetite for democracy. People want more democracy. And how do you do it? Well, you ask the court, and the court creates more rights and more liberties and more checks and more democratic institutions. This is exactly what justices know how to do. So, and it's not about the ego of Aharon Barak. And he had a huge ego. That's undeniable. But it's not about his ego. He would never have done that. He would never have been able to do it unless there was this popular appetite for that to happen. Okay, let me just show you a couple of examples, one from the legislature and one from the executive. Remy, so one more, please. So this is, again, it's a little hard, so I'll tell you the story quickly. Okay, this is international, the major conventions of the United Nations. Okay, the major conventions in the United Nations are signed by Israel shortly after they're passed. Okay, but for them to become binding, they should be ratified by the legislature. So signature happens at the executive, but it's up to the legislature, okay, the elected branch of the legislature to ratify them. What you see here, it starts in 1965, okay, and this is 1991. And the blue line is the number of conventions that were ratified. So you can see in some cases it takes 25 years, in some cases it takes 12 years, but the key story here is that in 1991, all of a sudden, Israel joins, and ratifies all of those the UN conventions that are at the heart of the human rights regime that the UN has created. Okay, so all of a sudden, the legislature in 1991 completely joins this liberal Western democratic regime. And I'll give you another example from the executive. Next one, please, Remy. So this is Yitzhak Shamir, okay, I mentioned him earlier, and this is the speech that he gives at the opening of the Madrid Conference for Peace, okay? I'll read that to you if it's a little hard to read. He says, in their war against Israel, and by the way, this is, echoes, again, I wasn't planning that to happen, but, echoes in what's happening today, and this was my point from the very beginning, but we'll get there maybe a little later. So in their war against Israel's existence, the Arab governments took advantage of the Cold War. They enlisted the military, economic, and political support of the communist world against Israel. And they turned the local regional conflict into an international powder keg. Okay, basically what he says, we are, the Israelis, okay, we were on the right side of the Cold War, and now we're even more so, okay? And our enemies were on the wrong side, and now, we're nice enough to make peace with them, or something like that, okay? But it's the Cold War, it's the idea that, the change of balance, okay, the fact that it was such decisive victory of liberal democracies in the Cold War that had this major influence on, these are the elected branches. I haven't said anything about the courts right now. This is an elected prime minister, completely independent from the court, okay? And what I showed you earlier was for the legislature. Remy, next one, please. Okay, so there are a few things that other than I wanted to say, but I think we're going to be, I do want to open it for discussion, ask any questions. So just 3 implications, okay? Implication number 1 is normative, okay? And the normative argument is that, again, what I was trying to refute here, this is a scholarly project, but it also has to do with, with public debate in Israel now, okay? What I was trying to refute is the argument that you have to have this reform because the justices usurp the power of the court. It's just not, it's normatively wrong to give so much power to the justices. And I think that if you buy my argument, if you buy my thesis, then this completely refutes the justification for the reform, the normative justification, right? Because what happens if you protect the Supreme Court and protect its independence, what you're protecting is not just the judicial institutions and judicial independence, etc. What you're actually protecting is the popular will. The people in Israel want more democracy, and the court was the one that was able to articulate what would that look like in terms of actual, the reality in terms of, rights and liberties and checks and balances and institutional and democratic institutions, etc. So one is normative. The second one is activist. So activist, okay? People who, people don't go on the streets anymore, but they did for 40 consecutive weeks up until October 7th, okay? When people take to the streets in Israel, okay, and they sing songs about the court, they protect the court, okay? But they also protect what the popular will is in Israel, okay? And the popular will is to be a democracy and have this democratic element very clearly. And Remy, one more, please. Okay, I'll get to the practical in a sec, just about the second point, okay? I know that some people here are Israeli and some people know Israelis, okay? Sometimes, we professors, sometimes we go into all those complicated theories. Sometimes the best thing is to just listen to what people say, okay? If you ask Israelis how they think about their country, what they're proud of in their country, how they define, how they recognize and identify the country, they would say, we are the only democracy in the Middle East. Okay? Across the board. Any Israeli that you ask. Whether they're right-wing or left-wing, rich or poor, women or men, minority, whatever. Okay? The only thing is that we're equally as well the only Jewish country in the Middle East. But nobody ever says that. Why? Because that's not the critical thing in the identity of the country. Okay? Democracy. This is the way that, we're a Jewish country for sure. Okay? But if you just look at what people say, how people identify themselves, it's as a Jewish, the only democratic country and the only democracy in the Middle East. And then the last point, and that's a whole new discussion, okay? Many people during the debate, the public debate around the reform, said that this is the time for a constitution, okay? And I think that this is completely wrong, okay? I think that everything that I said today indicates that if Israel wasn't ready for a constitution in 1948, okay, this vagueness is, complicated, uncomfortable, but it is an advantage. And I don't think this is the right thing to do. Well, now, it's a completely different reality, but even, on October 6th, 4 days ago. So I'll stop here. Remy, you can slide down one more. You have my contact information here, or you can just Google my name, and I'll be glad to take... Amy, how much time do we have? Are we out of time, or about 20? Oh, perfect. Yes, please. So, if you can just say who you are, it will be just so I get...
And so I have two questions. One, the best analyst of democracy that I know of is Alexis de Tocqueville. He says democracy can go in two directions, either towards freedom or towards authoritarianism and tyranny. And it seems to me that what's happening in Israel in part is there's a democratic tilt towards authoritarianism and against the liberal institutions that would be part of a free democracy. So that one has to, I think, differentiate between the two types of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
The second point is, I think if one looks at the Jewish population of Israel, it's very split. I mean, there are Ashkenazim who are liberal and want free institutions, but on the other side, and this comes from within our tradition as well.
From which tradition?
The Jewish tradition,
Mm-hmm.
that there is an authoritarian streak. And if you look at the population increase in Israel over the last 20 or 30 years, with the Russian immigrants and people who don't really have liberal sort of inclinations, it's the democratic authoritarian streak that's been strengthened by the recent election.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue is really, the Jewish population, I think, is split. There are liberals and there are also authoritarians. And also this democracy can go in one of two directions. So the question is, it's free democracy versus a kind of authoritarian democracy, which is what the right-wing coalition seems to be wanting.
What is authoritarian democracy? I'm not sure.
It's democracy. Tocqueville has this term called majority tyranny, the tyranny of the majority. You have the popular will, but the people act against rights and freedom. That would be one kind of
As opposed to liberal democracy. Okay. I thought you were actually going to say Robert Dahl when you said about the most influential person in the study of democracy. So, we can have this debate later. But because I think Robert Dahl actually talks a lot about what I said here. So I beg to differ, okay, on your... let's start with your second point, okay? This is actually part of my argument. I didn't get into this here. But the 1990s, another sea change that happens in Israel is a demographic story, okay? Israel has 4.5 million people in 1989, and then, the end of the Cold... And it's also because of the end of the Cold War. And then the Cold War ends, and many people immigrate from the former Soviet Unions to Israel, about 1 million, okay? So that's like a 20% increase, okay? And I think that works perfectly with my theory. Okay, it's my theory, so of course I'll think that way, but I'll tell you why, okay? Those people who leave the Soviet Union, okay, they look for an alternative to communist authoritarianism, okay? They are thirsty for democracy. They run away from communism. So when they move to Israel, okay, you get a huge boost for the democratic side. And beyond that, it is really, you hand a blow to the Jewish side. Why? Because those people are extremely not religious. Not sure, extremely secular or whatever, would be the word. Their political identity is distinctly not religious. Not just not Jewish, it's not religious, okay? So they really boost the democratic side, okay? And we know demographics, sometimes, I have some research looking at the effect of demographics on politics. It has a huge effect, okay? And when you increase the size of the population by 20%, and those 20% of the people are, for the most part, quite homogeneous in their support for democracy and their distaste for religion, then what I said about the 1990s just becomes, the kind of influence that I described just becomes clearer. Now, about the type of democracy, okay? Authoritarian democracy, or let's just call it authoritarian democracy, just seems to me, maybe de Tocqueville could say something like that, in 1830 or whatever. But, today it seems to me like you want to talk about liberal democracy or the alternative, okay? And again, I beg to differ, okay? When Israelis talk about their country as the only democracy in the Middle East, they do not talk about the fact that, or just about the fact that it has an elected prime minister, okay? They talk about the fact that it's they talk about gender equality. They talk about LGBT rights, okay? Not people from the left, not Ashkenazi. And by the way, I don't think that Ashkenazim are necessarily on the left, but let's forget about all this stuff, okay? People of all political stripes, okay, when they think about, when they identify themselves with the only democracy in the Middle East, it's not just because we have an elected head of government, okay? It's because of the liberal democratic principles that govern the way of life in Israel, okay? As I said, gender equality, minority rights, LGBTQ rights, and you can think about a bunch of other things. So I think that, and that's it. Yes, please. George.
First of all, thank you for your very interesting remarks. I have a couple of questions. The first one is that you indicated the incorporation of international human rights instruments. Shall I repeat it? Or?
Yes, so this way they record.
All right, okay. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is that you made the argument that the incorporation of international human rights instruments is a major turning point in the unbalancing between Jewishness and democracy in Israel. And towards, let's say, we tilt towards democracy. However, here is my question on this. More and more research shows the fact that you incorporate certain instruments that make you look good democratic is not the end of the story, because then the question is how these obligations are interpreted in the domestic level, and the contestation on how you interpret this obligation begins. Now, interestingly enough, some of these documents, instruments that you are referring about, talk also about minority rights issues. So one of the things that I want to ask you is that it seems to me there should have been some, and there is some serious contestation about this obligation that play on how you interpret, for example, minority issues within a human rights regime that you have incorporated that makes you look more and more democratic. So to what extent contestations have played and have influenced the balance between Jewishness and democracy, especially bearing into consideration that, as I said again, the human rights regime...
Ratifying them doesn't mean that you respect them.
Yes, exactly. So
okay.
I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the contestation and how this affects your argument that you are making on the obligations. The second one is, can you elaborate a little bit on your understanding of the doctrine of reasonableness?
Doctrine of what, sorry?
The doctrine of reasonableness by the Supreme Court. And again, how does this affect the controversy that we see unfolding in Israel concerning the
reform.
The suggested judicial reform? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. So thank you. Great question. All questions are great, and these two are great as well. So why did let me say first, I completely agree that ratifying does not mean implementing. And Israel is a good example, unfortunately. Israel, in many ways, did not implement those human rights. And I looked at it, therefore, more as a strong indication for the spirit of the days in Israel. The fact that the Israeli legislature, that had not bothered to do that for, in some cases, for 25 years, in 1 year ratifies all of them, shows you that there was, again, just think about, my argument is less about whether Israel is, completely in compliance with international law and international human rights. It is not, my argument is about whether in the 1990s, you had a top-down revolution where the court usurped the power of the people, which is the null hypothesis, or my argument that there was real popular appetite and hunger and thirst for more democracy. And what the court did was to realize, what the court and other institutions did.
Hi there, this is Pod.
What the court and other institutions did was to realize that and to make it happen. So the people wanted, and the government delivered. And I think the ratification, the serial ratification, is an example of that. So this is what this is trying to show. Remind me in one word the second question. Reasonableness. Oh, reasonableness. Yeah. So reasonableness was a major kind of rationale that the court used in the way it reviewed the actions of elected branches. What is reasonableness? Well, that's an entire doctrine, but the idea was that there is some kind of of judgment call that the justices should make. The justices, and this is true in general, right? Justices are not experts on anything. They are generalists, okay? They need to, in general, understand, the various topics that they need to discuss, and then have their doctrines that help them decide even without becoming experts. They have, friends of the court, they have all sorts of things that can help them, but at the end of the day, they need to have a judgment call in an area that oftentimes they are not experts on, okay? And this was the argument against the justices, okay? They used reasonableness as some sort of a general term, okay? While the elected officials whose actions were overruled by the court, okay, were the experts. And this was the idea. This is the argument against reasonableness. On the side of the justices, they said we have certain doctrines. So doctrines are, by the way, they're not doctrines that are just unique to Israel. They have to do with standards of international law, for instance. And we need to use them. If you take it away, my sense, by the way, reasonableness actually passed. This is the only element in the reform that actually passed. I mentioned 4 pillars. This is the one that passed. My sense is that in the long run, the implications of this one would be the least important, because the justices can reach similar rulings based on other doctrines as well. Okay? Proportionality, I can give you a few examples. But so I think reasonableness, the fact and that's, I think, also the reason why reasonableness passed, because the opposition realized that, if you want to choose your battles, you want to put everything on the Judicial Selection Committee, because if you let the coalition select the justices, then it's over. And the reasonableness story is less important, is important, but, to a lesser extent. Yeah, you had a question. Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
Thank you, Udi, for a very interesting presentation. I may have missed something very basic. So I'm wondering if you can tell me what you think is the explanation for why the current government was elected. If there's an appetite and a thirst among the people for this kind of judicial oversight, why would they elect such a sort of anti-democratic government?
Okay, that's a very good question, okay? And I guess the answer is that this government is a product of a coalition formation process, like any government in Israel, okay? People in Israel don't think about, when you cast a vote, when you cast your ballot, you think about the government, of course, but at the end of the day, you cast a vote for a party, okay? And the parties that oppose those democratic principles within the current coalition are a minority within the coalition, let alone within the entire legislature, okay? So people, when they elected this government, okay, they did not necessarily elect, this was not the number one issue on the agenda. In fact, it wasn't on the agenda at all, okay? The story of the judicial reform, okay, was not at all on the campaign in September, October, and November of 2022. Nobody talked about that. Okay, so people did not. This is and why? In my understanding, because this is it's understood that the court is so important. It's almost like it's like a constitutional arrangement. It's not a constitution, but it's a constitutional arrangement. This is something. This is like the basic standards that people want. That people live by, the way they understand themselves and their political system. What did people vote for? Well, these elections, like at least the 5 elections in the 3-year period before that, we had 5 elections in 3 years, okay, really boiled down to one question. Yes, Netanyahu, or no Netanyahu. This was the only thing on the agenda, okay? This is what people had in mind, and this is how people chose their political parties. Well, that also a little bit to do with our political identity, etc. So again, so the answer to your question is, what did they vote for? They voted for or against Netanyahu. They did not vote on this because this was not on the public agenda at all, okay? No, not only did politicians not talk about it, the only people that talked about it are political scientists and law school professors. And you know how many people we have listening to us, right? So, it was not there at all, okay? Yes, Dan, sorry.
So this is a question about data that follows on a bit from Ladon's question. Where would we go in Israel, does it exist, to get good polling data to kind of confirm this idea that the court's decision-making represents the popular will? And I asked that, reflecting on the American situation where you often have, issues-based referendums that may be, voted on in a way that does not reflect or that does not line up with, local politics. And an example I would come up with is, something like a minimum wage. I think there was a fairly recent minimum wage referendum in, say, Missouri, where politics are quite conservative. You get a sense that, the legislature is dominated by the Republican Party. Their line is obviously going to be against minimum wage, and yet the same people who are voting for that party are voting for, this specific issue against the party line. Is there that kind of issues-based polling data in Israel? Where do we find it? What does it indicate about the popular will?
Okay, so the political science discipline in Israel was largely, has been largely living within the null hypothesis that I described. So if you look at the popular, if you look at polls and surveys over the years, basically people were asked, how left-wing or how right-wing you are, just like here when you, how conservative or liberal you are on a five-point Likert scale or 7 or whatever, okay? And therefore, the empirical, I didn't show you much of the empirical stuff because I just didn't have time, but the empirical parts of this research, okay, I can't really use surveys because you never ask people what do you think is more important, democracy or Judaism. But I look at what the elected branches did and how they talked and how they discussed things and how they deliberated, okay? So one indication comes from the deliberation of Knesset committees, okay, in the weeks and months leading up to the basic laws of the early 1990s, okay? This is a government that was controlled by the right wing, okay? It wasn't like a left-wing government. The basic laws were, those basic laws were, I didn't mention them too much, but these were the basis for the constitutional revolution or the judicial revolution of the 1990s. They were passed by a right-wing government. You look at what the legislators from various parties talked about, assuming that they represent, what the people who sent them there asked them to do. You look at symposiums, okay, that were taking place. By the way, in this country as well, there's a major symposium in Washington, D.C. in 1991, just a week, I think, before, a week or two before the basic law is passed. Symposium where you have only members of Knesset from all major parties, okay? And you see, look what they talk about, okay? And you see that they talk about the end of the Cold War, they talk about democracy, they talk about the alliance to the United States, and they disagree on everything else, okay? But this is the one thing that they agree on. Another thing is the executive, and I go into many more executive decisions and speeches of the type that I showed you here. I also look at international relations and look at the kind of speeches that President Clinton gives in Israel. A Bulgarian president, a country in Eastern Europe that goes through this democratization process at the exact same period. Israel goes through a smaller democratization process. Bulgaria obviously is much more dramatic because they leave the Warsaw Pact. But so I look at indications from various elements. Another iteration of the research can look at things like even entertainment, and there could be other indications. So it's not going to be polls, but it's still it is already pretty comprehensive in terms of the getting the feel for where the people were at the time and where their elected officials were at the time and their preference. And there's more to be done, for sure. Yes, Dan.
Thanks so much, Udi. Again, it was a wonderful presentation. The 2000 American presidential election, as you may know, resulted with Al Gore, Democrat, winning the popular vote. But as a result of the American Supreme Court's Bush versus Gore decision, his competitor, Republican George W. Bush, won the Electoral College. So when Bush was inaugurated in January of 2001, his popularity was not significant. It was viewed as a minority candidate winner because of this technicality, again, in the Electoral College. But 9 or 10 months later, there was September 11th, with these terrible attacks upon the country. Americans rallied around the flag, and Bush's popularity skyrocketed. I wonder if a result of this past Friday's events and following, a similar thing may occur with regard to Netanyahu. And then indeed, my question is, do you think that his 2023 proposals to change the structure of the judiciary in Israel are now in fact going to be supported because he will be so popular as the leader of the country and defending it from these terrible external attacks?
Okay. So you're basically asking if Netanyahu is actually going to leave the current crisis that started 3 years ago so popular that he can do whatever he wants. I don't know. I can talk about two scenarios, okay, given the history of Israel. One scenario is that of the Yom Kippur War. Okay, the Yom Kippur War is exactly, as I said, 50 years and 1 day before the attacks on Saturday. Israel is surprised by the Syrian army and the Egyptian army, and this is considered a complete failure of the military and of the decision makers. And Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, a Jewish American, she was born in this country, has to resign, and there's this major investigation and a public committee, and that's the end of her political career. That's the end of the career of the chief of staff. So that's one thing that might happen. Okay, although history never repeats, so it might change. And the alternative, okay, I can talk about three scenarios, actually, okay? One scenario is what I said. The second scenario is what you said, that Netanyahu is very popular. And the third scenario, which I think is the most likely, okay, is that Israel is so divided now and so polarized, despite the fact that it's under attack, okay? You see the way these attacks are perceived already, 3 days after it happened, and it's just unfolding. It might get worse. Hopefully not, but it might. And people have their own, just like in America in many ways, you watch, Fox News, or you watch The Alternative, and it's like a split screen, a split reality. And then, after the day after, one side would expect a Golda Meir scenario, and the other side would expect a George Bush 2004 scenario, okay, when he's reelected, okay? And those sides will not be able to communicate, okay? And if at that point there's no institutional stability, okay, thanks to some sort of check in the form of a judiciary, I think that this is uncharted waters in terms of the future of Israeli democracy. This third scenario, which I think, with some approximation, is probably the most likely one. Yeah.
Hi, Udi. I'm Jean Carmelt from Political Science Department also. Thank you for this. And I just wanted to ask something about sort of differing versions of Judaism within Israel, particularly differences over what the Israeli opinions of a Jewish state look like, especially in relation to like the ultra-Orthodox, the role of the military, the Orthodox, and how that sort of relates to everything you're saying.
That's a good question. So, I'm trying to make things simple with two sides, Israeli and Jewish versus democracy, and you tell me what this one side is not very coherent, and you said that democracy is not just one side. So, these are good points. So I think, when you're in Israel, in Israeli, there is some intuitive understanding of what the Jewish elements mean, and for the most part, they are. So in America, you have Reform and Conservative and Orthodox and Ultra-Orthodox. They are probably closest to the Orthodox version of American Judaism. Okay, by and large. Again, I'm talking about the popular perceptions, right? I'm not talking about individuals. Okay, so you think about Jewish, it's mostly this Orthodox version of Judaism, which the reasons for that are institutional. They control this denomination, or this type of Judaism controls the relevant institutions in the country. Okay, the general rabbinate and others. Okay, and it has since the foundation of the state, since 1948, and probably before that as well. So So I think that this tension between Jewish and democracy, or Jewish elements and democratic elements, is largely between the kind of liberal elements of democracy on the one hand, and the orthodox version of Judaism. Okay, I don't think many reform rabbis in America would find many differences with those who oppose the reform, for instance. Okay, so I think it's really the reform. Judaism in America would oppose the reform, the judicial reform. It's the same word, but okay. So I think it's really the orthodox version of Judaism that is debated. The point of balance is between this orthodox version and the liberal version of democracy. Okay, and thanks. These are good points for clarification because we're out of time.
Okay, folks, we are out of time, but I'd like to thank Dr. Sommer for joining us for this lecture, and all fall as our visiting fellow. Thank you, Dr. Sommer.
Thanks.